Imagine having to send goods from London to Glasgow by sea or air, as the road network across Britain is too underdeveloped and not capable of handling mass transit of heavy goods, vehicles, or trains. This isn't for a lack of technology, funding, or even desire. Both London and Glasgow, and their respective surrounding regions, are highly developed. Both metropolises would benefit immensely from an advanced network of direct road and rail links. Well, this is the scenario we see today across Eurasia, the most resource-rich and largest landmass on Earth. Both the western and eastern extremities of the Eurasian continent are hyper-developed, yet are not connected by a proper road or rail network. The few roads that do exist are simply too basic to accommodate commercial traffic, and the Trans-Siberian Railroad is not designed or able to transport goods on any meaningful scale. There are no expansive networks of interconnected hubs allowing for merchandise to reach the loading depots from the factories. Also, the Trans-Siberian Railroad is not high speed and would need a complete overhaul. The vast expanses of Central Eurasia are currently very underdeveloped. There are roads, of course, but they are poorly maintained with no modern highways. These roads were built for the internal needs of each country within the region, such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and lack any kind of efficient interconnectivity with neighboring countries. This is the case from Western China all throughout the stands of Central Asia, into southern Russia and Ukraine. It's not until the Polish border that continuous multi-lane highways can be accessed, allowing goods to be transported uninterrupted all throughout Central and Western Europe along such modern highways. So, efficient land transportation exists at both ends of the Eurasian landmass, with a huge gap in between. Both ends would find it mutually beneficial to bridge this gap, bypassing the sea lanes, cutting lead times by weeks, and facilitating business. The economic benefits would be absolutely immense, not only for Europe and East Asia, but also the landlocked Central Asian nations and the Middle East. The construction of multiple road and railway networks would create countless jobs, boosting the economies of all these countries, not to mention the revenue generated from tolls and transit fees these countries can charge for allowing the use of their roads. This is exactly what China intends on doing, also known as the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. This term was first coined in 2013 when Xi Jinping announced the launch of this mega project. Their ambition is to connect not just Europe and East Asia, but all of Eurasia with roads extending into Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. Wherever there is a land bridge, there should be a road. If you look at the geography and the current sea routes being used to transport goods from the Far East into Europe, it actually makes no sense at all. They are long and literally take weeks, with several choke points along the way, causing bottlenecks, where a simple accident can lead to enormous disruption. Sea transportation is slow and inefficient. The energy needed for propulsion through water is much higher than on land. Water causes huge drag compared with air and ground contact of terrestrial vehicles. Air travel may be much faster, but that too requires huge amounts of energy to defy gravity, which places a cap on the amount of goods a single aircraft can actually carry. Ships may be able to carry larger loads than any land vehicle, but the time it takes simply outweighs the benefits when compared with land transportation that can traverse an entire continent in days rather than weeks, without the complications of loading and unloading at seaports. Goods can be sent from door to door. The ancient trade routes between the Far East and Europe date back over 2,000 years to around 130 BC, when the Han Dynasty began sending envoys west. Back then, Eurasia and North Africa were all that was in the known world. There was no Suez Canal, and sea trade was only localized. Goods and commodities made their way across the vast deserts, steppes, valleys, and plateaus of Central and Western Asia. There was no single road, but many interconnected trails that allowed merchants to trade everything from tea and spices to porcelain, and of course, silk, hence the name Silk Road. This route was long and fraught with dangers, not only from the harsh environments, but roaming bandits and opportunists. In many ways, it was the Wild West, or shall I say, the Wild East. This would have been factored into the costs of the much sought-after commodities desired by European aristocrats. The corridor was restricted by geography, with the Himalayas blocking any southern routes into and through India, and the vast cold expanses of Siberia mostly covered in forests to the north, the latter being completely inhospitable for much of the year, thus rendering any northern routes impossible. Only the center in what is today Kazakhstan offered access to traders, who often traveled in caravans for protection against marauding bandits in search of easy loot. Central Asia was never under any single rule, other than perhaps the Mongols for a short time. Thus, these routes were never kept in good repair or made safe for travelers. Instead, these vast lands were made up of various empires and kingdoms that came and went. The Persians, however, maintained power over the western regions, while the lands to the east, all the way to China, were mainly under the various Turkic tribes, the same peoples who eventually formed the Turks of the Ottoman Empire, who then conquered Asia Minor. It's important to note that the Silk Road was not only the means of transport and exchange of physical materials, but also ideas and knowledge. Innovations shared across the Silk Road allowed for technologies to be introduced at both ends of Eurasia. For example, gunpowder from China, which needs no emphasis on the profound impact this had on European history. So what happened? Why did trade not continue across this land bridge? The answer is the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the conquest of the Ottomans, who closed off the trade routes between Europe and Asia. Or more specifically, the choke point, that is, Constantinople, which is where all goods from China and across Eurasia entered Europe. This was the valve, or the tap, from which all these wonderfully exotic goods flowed into Europe. The party was over. The Ottomans used their new key geolocation to leverage power and choke off not only luxury goods, but other materials that Christendom could use against them. For 15 centuries, trade was predominantly over land with Europe and Asia, exchanging everything from precious stones to the Black Death or the Plague. However, as geopolitics change, so did trade, and for a few centuries, the two poles of Eurasia became more isolated from each other. The Age of Exploration and Sea Power. with the Ottomans looking to further their conquests and making further gains with ever more incursions into southeastern Europe. The kingdoms of Western Europe, longing for exotic commodities, began searching for alternative routes east. The north was too cold, and the south was closed by the Ottomans, which meant traveling east was not possible. This left only one other option: west. The small kingdom of Portugal, at the western extreme of the Eurasian continent, only had the Atlantic Ocean open to them, as their larger cousin Spain completely dominated their western border. They had no choice but to explore the vast oceans if they were to compete with their neighbors. They sent expeditions further and further down the African coast and eventually made it to the Southern Cape, which is today's South Africa. Their persistence paid off as they made their way to the Far East, setting up trade posts all along the way from South Africa to India. A new Silk Road had been established across the seas. Free from competition and bandits, the Portuguese found the hack everyone in Europe had been looking for, and for a time enjoyed exclusivity, bringing in riches. But it wasn't long until other European powers discovered their secret, namely the Spanish. Later came the French, the Dutch, and the British, with their mighty navy, which was to become the most formidable, allowing for control of the sea lanes, which by the 18th century was the highway linking east and west. By the 19th century, Britain was the undisputed ruler of the seas, giving London access to every corner of the globe, allowing power to be projected far and wide. Dominating the sea lanes meant extended authority over trade, with the empire controlling key bottlenecks from the Straits of Malacca and Gibraltar to the Suez. Global trade was at the mercy of the British. The Royal Navy could be used to leverage power and strong-arm rivals in political disputes, giving the UK the status of global hegemon, which continued until 1945, by which time it had been severely weakened by 2 world wars. Enter the United States with its intact industry and gargantuan navy. It was time for Washington to pick up the relay stick and assume the role held by Great Britain for the previous 150 years. The US, like Britain, is a sea power, and the legacy of the old empire continued as such. Today, the US Navy is larger than the next 13 navies combined. It has and is used to enforce Washington diktats upon its vassals and colonies, either by intimidation or destruction if necessary. It is America's stick of tyranny used to keep its global empire under control. Global trade is at the mercy of the American deep state, which uses the Navy as a global police force. Sea trade is ideal for US foreign policy, as it gives Washington the ability to leverage control and sanction non-compliant states. This explains why the US is so alarmed by the BRI, as it will completely undermine US hegemony and jurisdiction, as less and less trade takes place at sea and in favor of the new land routes being built by China, not only in Central Asia, but the entire world island.
Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
If the BRI succeeds, and the highly modern, intricate network of road and railways spread across Eurasia, the sea lanes will be rendered obsolete, as the vast majority of trade will take place on land. This, along with the demise of the petrodollar, will diminish America's power to the point of irrelevancy, at least in Eurasia. The land bridge across Central Asia is the most logical and direct pathway for the mass transit of goods between Europe and China. Sending freight by sea is hopelessly inefficient and gives the United States power that it is increasingly abusing. However, Washington is working tirelessly to undermine China's mega projects by funding opposition groups who commit acts of sabotage, attack, and outright kill Chinese workers in what amounts to nothing less than terrorism. This shows America's despotic nature, as it can no longer compete with China and is resorting to state-sponsored terror. This is nothing new. The only difference is how brazen DC has become. China builds bridges as America destroys them, quite literally. All the US can offer now are abstract notions of quote-unquote supporting democracy, protecting human rights, freedom and equality. All these vague, ambiguous ideas that are so subjective, no one can properly define them. Yet many still fall for these fake values that are sold with promises of prosperity. They are misled into believing these opposition groups, funded by the US through NGOs like the National Endowment for Democracy, are serving their best interests, when all that happens is they become vassals of DC and subservient to the New World Order. The BRI represents another nail in the coffin of the global American empire, which is currently lashing out as it tries to stay alive for just a little bit longer. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe, like and share, and please consider leaving a donation. I have recently been demonetized, so anything would be appreciated. Until next time.